It's a very great moment for us to be
Es un
visited by
gran
Fidel,
momento para nosotros estar aquí con Fidel,
because what he has done for us
porque lo que Fidel ha hecho por
is
nosotros
difficult to put in words.
es difícil de describir.
Hi, I'm Malika Bilal.
I'm Ahmed Shabaddin, and you're in the stream. Today, Castro's global legacy.
From anti-colonialism to healthcare, how did Castro impact the world?
It's a deep pain I feel because of the loss. For those born after the revolution have no understanding of what he represents to us. He liberated us.
Cuba is mourning the death of longtime leader Fidel Castro. While Castro's authoritarian socialist rule divides supporters and foes, less discussed is his global imprint. Under Castro, a small island nation played an outsized role on the world stage.
As a champion of internationalist solidarity, Castro tightened bonds within the global South. Cuban doctors were deployed around the world for training and aid. And in Latin America, Castro backed leftist allies and influenced the recent wave of progressive governments. In Africa, thousands of Cuban troops supported independence movements and ultimately helped defeat South African apartheid. And Castro inspired anti-colonial sentiment by defying longtime U.S. efforts to overthrow him.
At a public memorial in Havana this week, world leaders paid tribute.
We join the progressive forces of the world in mourning and celebrating the life of this renowned internationalist and anti-imperialist who selflessly supported the struggles of the oppressed and exploited.
Brothers and sisters, my warmth, my respect, my admiration for Fidel for all the things he did for humanity. That's why, brothers and sisters who were born in Cuba, the pain you are carrying is the pain of the Bolivian people.
So as the world looks back on Fidel Castro, today we look at Fidel Castro's impact on the world. Joining us to discuss, Dave Sandoval, a Cuban-American musician and commentator. James Early, former director of Cultural Heritage Policy at the Smithsonian Institution and a board member of the Institute for Policy Studies. Yasmin Yonis, a human rights advocate and writer. And Amalia Dace-Gerbino, assistant professor at the University of Missouri. Welcome everyone to the stream. James, I want to start with you and something on my laptop because you just returned from Cuba. So I have some pictures here posted on your Facebook page not too long ago. I'm just going to scoot through a few of them. We see the crowds gathered there, and then we see a whole host of foreign leaders, foreign dignitaries who showed up at this ceremony. So James, when you think of Cuba's impact on foreign policy and his impact overseas, what comes to mind?
Well, Cuba had a huge impact through the social justice ethic of Fidel Castro. That ethic should not be measured up against the individual personality. It should be measured up in how the policies of the Cuban Revolution came out with solidarity policies and doctors and things of that sort, and how people felt that they could move to self-determination themselves. That is really, I think, the international impact of his individual social moral ethic. Now, he as an individual is like every other individual. There are things you like, there are things that you don't like. But I don't say that as a 50-50 balance. In the final analysis, when I added up, he made a huge contribution to global humanity. And in that context, he was a fallible individual who is to be judged by his actions.
So Dave, as a Cuban American sitting here and listening to that, what do you think of what James, his take on that?
I mean, look, there's no doubt that Cuba and Castro personally had a huge role in, or an outsized role in the world. What I think that is problematic to me is kind of the balancing is, you know, as you just mentioned, you know, the good and the bad. For me, it's hard to kind of offset one with the other, because a lot of the activities that he did abroad and in Africa and in Latin America all came at the cost of the Cuban people. And the Cuban people were never given a choice in this. They never elected him as a leader. They were never given a choice as to what they wanted to do. So, you know, to me, the cost to Cuba of that international activity is something that we can't forget.
And Amalia, when you hear that, saying something that we can't forget, I want to read two tweets that came in back to back. Sumaya Toba saying to us, it's hard not to romanticize Castro's anti-colonial stances, especially when looking at what Trump's win means. She goes on to say, but we need to remember that every political hero is the villain in another narrative. Those are the voices we need to seek out. I'm just curious what you make of all this all good, all bad dualism. A lot of people trying to remember Castro's legacy, trying to frame him as either inherently evil or good. How do you view it?
Well, I think, the dichotomy is a Western binary, for one, right? So I think the fact that we're talking about hero, villain, bad, and good is something that comes from colonialism and imperialism, really. And so that's something that I try to challenge in my research and my work. But as a Cuban American and an Afro-Cuban, kind of following Dave's piece just now when he commented about being a Cuban American and about the global solidarity and how it was on the backs of the Cuban people, or despite the Cuban people, I would argue, one, what Cuban people are we talking about? We need to talk about the racial pieces in Cuba as well, right? Absolutely. So there's Black Cubans, mulatto Cubans, which I categorize as Black, and white Cubans. So thinking about the gains that Afro-Cubans made in Cuba post the revolution is important. The educational gains and the employment gains that were made in literacy when it comes to Afro-Cubans. So I think I always try to urge my colleagues who are Cuban Americans to really think about this within a racial critique as well.
Absolutely. I just have to say, we can never forget the racial component, especially in a country that's 60 to 70% African or mixed race. I think that the binary distinction, like Amalia said, is something that I think is not a useful one, because everything in Cuba is not black or white. It's a million shades of gray, and paradox, I think, is really the guiding principle. In Cuba, in Spanish, you say sí pero no, yes but no, and everything has, there's two sides to every coin. So
you said a million shades of gray. I had to write that down because that really encapsulates this entire conversation. Yasemin, I want to bring you in here on that note, because you tweeted something not too long ago that caught the eye of producers here, and a lot of other people got 306 retweets. This is what you wrote. I struggle with Cuba, sided against Somalis getting our indigenous land back from Ethiopia, my family still occupied, jailed, beaten, killed. Explain to us what went into this tweet and what you meant.
Well, I kept seeing everyone on Twitter and throughout the mass media talking about Castro is either, again, this binary of evil or angel, of this anti-colonial, anti-imperialist hero, or this socialist, and socialist meaning a negative word, demon of sorts. And for me, I feel like we need some nuance. And as someone who's been affected by Castro's foreign policies, my parents, he backed Ethiopia in the Ethiopian-Somali War. Britain, during the time, Britain gave our indigenous land to Ethiopia, and Somalia decided to get it back. And it was backed by the indigenous people on that land, which were including my family. Castro, decided to back up Ethiopia and helped the Ethiopian regime of that time beat Somalia. And what happened is that Ethiopian regime killed 500,000 people in Ethiopia. It also slaughtered many Somalis, and my people are still paying that price. My parents both became refugees in '77 because of that war, and my family still lives in occupation. And so when we talk about Castro being this hero of Africa, well, we are Africans too, and he is not a perfect man, and he made some decisions that have horrific repercussions today.
Well, I would take. First of all, Mengistu is not someone to be supported, and I too would share your critique. But to come to a summation that this was Fidel Castro is again to hold him up as a figure larger than life. There were Somalians and Ethiopians who made decisions. Now, Fidel Castro is to be held accountable for his support, but he is not to be held.
And that's what I'm doing.
Right.
And I'm not making it. If I can interrupt, I have a problem with people coming in and saying Castro is the reason that all these revolutions were able to happen on the continent. He was an important part. His support, he was on the right side for a lot. But just like it wasn't Castro that freed the people of Angola or South Africa or Algeria, it was the people there I am holding him in the same way accountable for his support in Ethiopia and Somalia. So he's not the biggest, but we're talking about his foreign policy.
Well, Yasmin and James, because you're having this back and forth, if I could just interject to get some community in here. They're talking about this very same issue around the world, really, not just in Africa, but let's start in Africa. Hank Zhu saying, I am an African, and so Castro's efforts to assist fellow Africans in their liberation struggles resonates very deeply with me. We also have Deepak saying, here in India, Castro's death received wide and sympathetic coverage. He's considered a friend of India. We also have Paul saying, in Zimbabwe, the mainstream media has celebrated Fidel Castro's life. Cuba under Castro played an immense role in liberation wars. You were going to say?
Yeah, I think what's not being talked about here is the people of Cuba, because a leader should be accountable first and foremost to his own people.
Well,
okay?
I'm going to stop you right there, and the only reason I am is because on the flip side, we do have someone saying, Albert, my message to the late Fidel Castro is charity begins at home, start liberating the home. What do you mean by that, though?
He just made my point for me, because, you have all these people here talking about how their liberation struggles and they're trying to be free from dictatorship, and in the case of Somalia they were trying to resist a dictatorship, but and everybody's celebrating that.
But what do you mean starts at home?
But why are we not condemning the dictatorship that was at home, aka Cuba? Why are we not condemning that? Why can't Cuba have its own homegrown liberation where we could have elected leaders, we could have a free press, where we can have a participatory, multi-party democracy?
But Cuba did have its own liberation. First of all, this was a nationalist revolution. Although Fidel Castro was a Marxist, this was a nationalist revolution. Fidel Castro followed the Martí perspective. He is the founding father, hero of the ideology of nationalism. Now, the fact that it became a socialist revolution is not totally synonymous with one individual. When the South Africans ask, the Angolans ask for assistance from Africa, people volunteered for that. When there are disasters around the world, people volunteered for that. And are there people who disagree with socialism in Cuba? Yes. And do they speak out? Since Raul Castro's administration, through the National Assembly, yes, he is Fidel Castro's brother, but he didn't pick up the phone and say, make my brother president. He said, I'd like to see my brother president in the same way that Clinton would like to see his wife as president of the United States, but it has to go through a process. There is a National Assembly.
So I'm going to just jump in there just for a second, because we've heard the word Angola, we've heard the country Angola a couple of times, and I want to make sure our audience is on the same page that we're on. Some of our audience is, because we asked, we're looking at Castro's influence in global politics. Is there a specific story that comes to mind when you think about Castro? We got this answer. This is Hank Zhu, who says, one word, Angola, exclamation mark. So I want you all to have a look at this clip. This is a 1975 speech, just a little bit of it, because we all know Fidel Castro had a tendency to go on for hours in his speeches. So this is a clip of a 1975 speech in which he explains his reasons for Cuba's intervention in Angola. Have a look.
Some imperialists ask themselves why the Cubans are helping the Angolans, what our interests are. They are accustomed to thinking that a country does something only in search of oil, diamonds, copper, or other natural resources. Our interests are not materialistic, and it is only logical the imperialists can't understand that. Their criteria is based only on chauvinistic, nationalistic, egotistic reasons. We are carrying out our international duty in helping the people of Angola.
So, Molly, I know you have family in the military, some of whom served in Angola?
Yes, so my aunt actually is a nurse in Cuba, and she went to Angola to provide her services to the Angolan people. And so I totally understand, the point to be made. And again, it seems like, what we're really saying is that, there's the imperfect human being, Fidel Castro, and then there is, the movement and anti-colonial struggle that he was a part of. So, I argue that, we shouldn't see him in a binary. And I would argue again that, the Cuban people, some Cuban people and specifically Afro-Cubans have made educational and employment gains post the revolution. The gains that they have made in Cuba, are something that the U.S. hasn't even made. So I think that's very key.
Who are critical. Esteban Morales Dominguez, a black Cuban communist who is a patriot, a nationalist, embraces the revolution. Read his The Racial Problematic in Cuba. You can get it on Monthly Review. But he's a Cuban nationalist. They are mediating their own discussions. You've got the Jose Aponte Committee Against Racism that they cosmetized. They initially inaugurated it as the Committee Against Racism and Discrimination, their terms, and then within a few months they changed it to a historical reference. The Jose Aponte, you've got the Articulation of Regional Afro-Descendants. So there's an internal mediation among Cuban citizens discussing and debating among themselves.
Within certain boundaries.
So Yasmin, you go first, and then Dave, you follow. Go ahead.
If I can bring some nuance to the conversation, even as a Somali who was negatively affected by Castro's foreign policy, I agree with the majority of his foreign policies and even his domestic. But as someone on the outside, I feel like as a socialist myself, as a Pan-African, as someone who believes in the liberation of Black people everywhere, he was able to give something to Afro-Cubans, but also Black people around the world, a sense of hope. He was symbolic for his anti-imperialist dedications. And I think that for a small island 90 miles outside of America, which is the empire of today, which has committed more human rights abuses, and including on Guantanamo Bay, than anyone else in modern history, I think that Castro is more symbolic than anything for a lot of us. And I think we appreciate it. And when you're talking about what he means to people on the ground in Cuba, and that they didn't choose him, well, you tell me, when has democracy or elected officials ever given liberation in the United States? They have never.
The measure of this is not to compare the U.S. versus Cuba. That's not what we're talking about.
But why not?
Because
it's very difficult to talk about Cuba
because if Cuba
globally without America's empire.
We're seeing Cuba.
No, but look, the thing is that the U.S. policy toward Cuba has always been used as a justification for oppressive policies in Cuba, and that's just a distraction. It's a deflection. It doesn't answer the question. If there are imperialist forces coming into Cuba, whether they're from the U.S. or from the Soviet Union at the time, you know, that's a different conversation. But that does not justify the systematic repression of free speech.
What is your people's position in
But
Cuba?
we're not justifying it.
But I don't know that anyone's justifying it.
But that's what I'm hearing.
From who?
I think it's important to locate who you are in Cuba, because as our Afro-Cubana sister is talking about, her interactions with Castro's policies are much different than you as a white-skinned Cuban. I don't know how you identify, but it's important for you to position yourself as, what did your people lose and what did her people gain?
And exactly my point too, and I didn't share my background, but you know, my father was a political prisoner in Cuba, right?
Yeah,
so
and
I came here as a refugee.
was as well.
Yeah, so I came here as a refugee, so I understand the family and personal dynamics that comes with, you know, a household that is anti-Fidel, but at the same time understanding the global struggle and his involvement in the consciousness of Pan-Africanism and African people.
Well, I understand the symbolic value, because I think the thing that we're talking about here is Fidel, you know, not just the death of a man, but of a symbol. And we were talking backstage how symbols are so important in Cuba, and what he might mean symbolically.
But he was more than a symbol.
He was more than a symbol.
He provided 30,000 troops to Angola.
Indeed, he was more than a symbol.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah, and those are all Cuban lives.
Well, if I can just quickly interject, I just want to point out, we have a lot of people who are echoing a lot of different sides of these nuanced arguments that you guys are saying. One person, Belina, on Twitter, saying this is a narrative, how she frames the narrative about Cuba in her country, a hero of the third world. So for as much as we're talking about symbols, I do want to just play for you a clip of this video we received from Belina, where she outlines why he meant so much to her.
My name is Belina Nzane from Lesotho. I benefited from Fidel's mind of thought that third world countries should have a competitive advantage in international sports competition. So he created a special university for third world countries called the International School of Physical Education and Sports. Today I'm a specialist in physical education and sports with a complete research paper on how to improve the quality of life of people living with HIV and AIDS through physical activities.
Yasmin, when you hear that, I mean, what comes to mind? Because a lot of people are tweeting to us, saying that they can relate to, what you shared with us as Somalians who remember their Cuban soldiers rounding up their village in the war. But then you hear this from Belina.
I can hold both of them at the same time, and I think if I can hold it, then others should be able to hold it. Yes. Castro is a human being, and I think that we're using his death, his body, as an opportunity to really debate not his legacy, but socialism versus capitalism. That's what I'm seeing a lot of the narrative on the outside is. And he made a lot of correct decisions. I think that for Somalia, Ethiopia, he did not make the right decision, especially as someone who's supposed to be anti-imperialist, anti-colonial. He did not side with those who had lost, who were trying to get back their land that was taken away by the colonizer. So he made a mistake that is easy.
Like many leaders, right? You could say that of Bush in Iraq. You could say that about leaders all over the world, of course, to your point.
Yes, and I don't want to minimize by people's pain because they're still going through it today. But I also, I'm not in any way sympathetic to white Cubans who criticize Castro because they're no longer able to dominate, exploit the people of Cuba. I'm not. Well, or any other people on the right.
So, I mean, it's interesting hearing you say that because, of course, it can't be a monolith, right? All white Cubans can't be a monolith. Right. I want to let Dave respond to that, but I know, James, you also had something to say. So, Dave, you go first.
Oh, yes. Well, look, I mean, I have such profound love and respect for the Afro-Cuban community. As a musician, my music has its root and its soul coming from Afro-Cuban sounds. And so, and I connect very deeply with the Afro-Cuban struggle. I'm all in favor of, lifting up that segment of our population, my brothers and sisters in Cuba. But what you see in
because you play their music, I don't understand that connection.
Because it's part of our culture. It's part of our shared culture. And in Cuba, we do have a blend of the European and African culture, which has created something new and beautiful, and which I hold very near and dear to my heart. And the thing is, what you see in Castro's, upper echelons, you see it's a bunch of old, white, European, fair-skinned men.
That's not true.
And
that's not true.
predominantly.
So James, go ahead.
Predominantly.
Right, indeed.
Racism.
Right.
Castro did not eradicate racism in Cuba.
Precisely.
We know that.
Absolutely.
That's cultural. That's cultural. That's also ingrained in the history of what of Cuba as well. So I think that it's important to understand that racism still exists in Cuba.
Yes, it does.
Sure.
Yes, it does. Let me just say, first of all, I appreciate Yasmin's and the professor's methodological approach to this. And as a fellow socialist, I am also aligned in a general sense with where you are. Two quick things. The key thing is Cubans in Cuba are debating and mediating their own realities. There's huge debate going on in Cuba. Precisely because of Raul Castro coming in, the first thing he said is, we do not have enough criticism in this country. And then he said to the Communist Party, you are indispensable in this country, but you are not the citizenship and you are not the government. And we have to understand the calibration of that triad. There is a vigorous discourse about participatory democracy going on in Cuba because the Communist Party, as well as Cuban citizens, recognize one of the most educated populations in the world, according to the United Nations.
And healthcare, for example.
And healthcare and so forth and so on, who don't produce anything because of the paternalism of centralism and traditional Marxist orientation. We will do for you. Now that discourse is going on is how do we work with the Cuban people as stewards of their interests, not as substitute for their interests. Now, Fidel Castro's policies, his social justice ethic policies, have been exported around the world in healthcare and sports and ballet and so forth and so on. And finally, on the question of race, I think it is the principal question in the democratic question today. I asked Fidel Castro in 2009 when I visited in his home about the question of race. His view is that it's a cultural problem. Well, you can put more faces
and
problem.
Systemic. I'm going to pause you there because I'm actually intrigued on what you responded to that because, of course, it's something that's systemic and something that can't just be done away by saying it's culture. Precisely. So we are going to talk about it in the post show. That does it for today's show on TV. The conversation will continue online. You saw how heated it got. Our website is stream.aljazeera.com, #AJStream. We will see you online. Welcome back. We're in our online post-show discussion. As we headed into it, our guests were saying, can Yasmin and Amalia still hear us? Yes, because there's still so much to say. So we're going to get right back to that discussion. So where we paused was a conversation that you, James, were having with Fidel Castro in 2009 on race.
Right, and he said it was a cultural question. And here's the issue. There's a huge critique in Cuba about the absence of wholesome views of Afro-descendants, Afro-Cubans on television. Huge critique about the absence of Afro-Cuban history and African history in the textbooks. And that's very, very important. But the bottom line question is the ability of citizens to earn their own living, to participate fully as citizens, not only on their self-interest, but in the interest of the nation. And that's a question, that's a material question. That's not a cultural question. In Cuba, I have been called a mulatto, James earlier. Este mulatto que conoces mucho sobre los cubanos. Because the question of color...
I see Amalia kind of nodding there in recognition.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I understand. Cuban is a lot of colorism.
Right.
So there's a lot of colorism.
Yes.
Right.
But, you know, I really wanted to interject in a quick point when we're talking about race, James, and bring this back to this understanding of how Cuban Americans see themselves within the U.S. outside of the racial critique and politics of the United States of America. So where are Cuban Americans when it comes to Black Lives Matter?
Precisely.
Where are Cuban Americans when it comes to aligning with
I'm right
reforming
there
the
with
police
you.
system and the prison industrial complex? Where are Cuban Americans there?
I
You're always
can speak for
anti-Fidel,
myself,
but
Amalia. I'm right there with you 100%.
But I think her point is that
100%.
I think it is a
But
small
as a collective, where are Cuban Americans
as a collective?
Where are they?
They've been
I think
they've
if
been
I could
racist.
interject,
Yeah.
if I could interject, I think it's important to note that socialism does not eradicate anti-Blackness in any
Exactly.
way.
Oh,
it's an
I
important movement in progressing a nation, but it's not. And we need to bring to our analysis of socialism and like progress that Cuba and other countries can make the issue of anti-Blackness a global problem.
Well,
and it's not just an issue
can I
of
just
not
say one
seeing
thing?
Black faces in the country. If I could finish,
Yeah, go
it's not
ahead.
an issue of just seeing Black faces in the country. It's an issue of who has more access to wealth, who has access to health care, who
has a
what are
voice.
the living
Well,
conditions.
if I just may, Yasmin, because you brought up healthcare, and we've heard, you know, various people talk about how, as you said, Dave, you can't compare America to Cuba, or it's not necessarily productive. But yet we're talking about where are the Cuban Americans, as we heard, from, forgive me, I forgot.
Amalia.
Amalia, yes, forgive me, Amalia. But the reason I bring this up is because, you know, we kind of just went over healthcare, which you mentioned in part. And I'm not trying to create any false equivalencies, but a lot of people online talking about how they're doctors, how they've gotten free, healthcare.
Lower infant mortality rate
Right,
than the United States
so
of
just
America,
a couple of things that I think is important,
drugs,
Dave, and this is what I'm saying, beyond the anti-cancer drugs and that, the marker of a population's health. The most accurate marker is your life expectancy. Cubans, as compared to America, have the exact same life expectancy and have for decades. They have the best doctor-to-patient ratios in the world. So I'm just saying, those things, I'm curious in your opinion, those things and how Castro and his legacy has managed to provide that to his people as compared with a lot of other developing countries who couldn't. What are your thoughts? I mean, do you see that as a positive for the people of Cuba?
So look, what I said before is that it's a million shades of gray and two sides to every coin. Paradox. So, you know, high literacy rate, we love it. I love it. I'm all for it. What I would love to see is a high literacy rate with a free press, because there's censorship of opinions.
I would love to see in America a free press with healthcare. Hold on, I'm just saying.
I agree.
There is a big...
Wait, let's let Dave just finish his point, and then James will...
But I'm just saying.
Yeah, we'd love to see more free speech in every country in the world. But that doesn't take away...
They're not mutually exclusive.
They're not mutually exclusive. I would love to keep the high literacy rate, but add... Yeah, who wouldn't? And you know, can we have a high or a low infant mortality? Can we have a long life expectancy? But can we have a healthcare system that's more available to more of the people as opposed to the Communist Party elite?
That's not true.
There are things that is absolutely true.
Listen,
that is absolutely true.
I've been going to Cuba 40. I've been going to Cuba 40 years.
Why is life expectancy that high as compared to a lot of other countries?
And right now in Cuba, there
has
has been a debate over the last 24 months inside Grandma, the Communist Party organ.
The only permitted newspaper.
That
is true, right?
That is true. That is absolutely true. And people are jailed when they create their own free press.
No.
Just making sure. Okay, so finish your point, James.
Democracy, demos, is about ordinary people. Krasia, about the power of ordinary people acting for themselves. Now, what the United States wants to do is to impose, well, you got to act just like we act. And But there is a democratic debate and process and policy changes going on in Cuba. We have a right and we should have our opinions and our critiques and our praises, but we should be honest by reading and getting the facts to see how Cubans are mediating their own future. There is a new policy in Cuba that you cannot be head of the government for more than 2 5-year terms.
It's a liberal fallacy.
That's it. That's in the Constitution. Yes, Yasmin.
Yeah, it's a liberal fallacy to believe that free press means that you're more toward progress. And as someone with a journalism background and who very much values free press, I think it's important. But what a lot of people who are more sided with this American idea of democracy believe is that the crimes of capitalism are okay and normal. It's fine as long as you're the New York Times, but in the streets of New York, you have people starving to death outside the New York Times building. And I rather, while it's important to have free speech, I think it's first important to have food on the table and a roof over your head. And we need both of them, but I don't trust people who say that the most important thing is freedom of speech. Well, if I'm dead, how am I going to speak?
Just one quick tweet that kind of cuts at this conversation and reaffirms this idea that there's nuance on all sides. A doctor who we're talking, we're praising Cuba for its medical record, saying, I'm a Cuban American, I'm an MD, a cardiologist, just and only when I disagreed with Castro's communist ideas, he was immediately arrested. At least that's what he's saying. No way to verify that, of course, but still goes to prove what you're saying.
CubaArchive.org records all of these, and there's so many of these stories. Look, I agree with what Yasmin and James were saying. Look, I wouldn't want to see U.S.-imposed change. I would want to see change in Cuba to come from the people, because that's the only place where it really should come from, right?
Exactly.
So, but there's been this symbolic and very real impediment to change because there's only been one person running the show and calling the shots. And now. And I
actually agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so that I'm going to pause it because I'm going to pause it right there because I liked it because Yasmin said you agreed with Dave. James said not true. So really that could start a whole 30 more minutes of debate. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. I want to give our last words to our 2 Cuban Americans on this panel because I pulled up something on my screen here and it's intriguing. This is from about 10 years ago. Dave, this is yours. It is a music video. I want all of us to have just a little taste of this. So you wrote a song about the day that we really just saw, when Fidel Castro would no longer be in charge in Cuba. What are you feeling now, post that?
What I'm feeling is just a tremendous sense of hope, because what people were celebrating there was not necessarily the death of a man, but rather an impediment to progress and for an impediment to the Cuban people having their own voice. I would love to see the Cuban youth and this new generation to become the authors of their own future and not something that the U.S. imposes. What I feel that now is finally, instead of following this Fidel script that we've had for 47 years, finally, it's a blank page, and I'm so excited about that. And that is really what Cuban Americans were celebrating, banging pots in the streets of Miami.
And I'm smiling because next to you, James is shaking his head.
If you expect Cubans to behave and not be loud,
as our second Cuban American on this panel, what are you feeling?
So, my research and the work that I do here at the University of Missouri is in higher education. And I was just in Cuba in April at a conference for Paulo Freire. And, Cuba has done excellent work when it comes to higher education. And Cuba is a model, should be a model for the U.S. when it comes to college accessibility for Afro-Cubans, for Black folks, for Latino folks, for brown folks. We can learn from the Cuban model, and I'm looking forward to doing work in Cuba and learning from Cuba when it comes to higher education.
I love that thought. I want to thank all of our guests for this riveting conversation. So much to kind of ponder on. Thank you to Dave Sandoval, James Early, Yasmin Yonis, and Amalia Dache Gerbino. I will give the final word, though, to our community.
Of course, why not? They've been very, very loud on this one. Albert Marty saying, and maybe we can all in the studio and on the interwebs agree on this, he taught world leaders, especially in Africa, to be bold, stand up for what they believe, will help their countries, and have faith. I think maybe we can agree on that.
I don't know.
Not quite. All right.
Dave
well, the
is
conversation, the conversation continues.
Online. See
Yeah,
you there.
maybe you guys can connect and hash that one out.
So you will send our email.